Qassem Soleimani was one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East,
with close links to a network of paramilitary groups that stretches from Syria to Yemen.
And tonight we are learning a top Iranian commander was killed in a missile strike.
Welcome to episode 27 of Tahrir Podcast. My guest today is Arash Azizi, an Iranian journalist, author, and PhD candidate at NYU, not for long. Azizi writes extensively on various Iran-related topics, and in this episode we'll be discussing his book, The Shadow Commander Soleimani, the US and Iran's global ambitions. The book looks at the life and influence of General Qassem Soleimani, the former commander of the Quds Force, one of the strongest tentacles of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, aka the IRGC. And in so doing, Azizi provides insights into Soleimani's life and overall Iranian history and foreign policy very thoroughly. And I'm pleased to finally have him on Tahrir Podcast. Welcome, Arash.
Hello, it's great to be with you, Nasser. Thank you for having me.
Of course, welcome. So what inspired you to write a book specifically about General Qassem Soleimani and his role as the shadow commander?
I was interested in Soleimani and working on him, researching him for a long time as a journalist. I used to be a journalist before entering academia. And what really was specifically interesting in him for me was his ability to gather the support and loyalty of many people in the Arab world. Now, the relationship between Iran and the Arab world, as you know, has sort of always been rocky, both culturally. There's actually there's a big wall of separation between us, ironically, that there's very little people to people links. Ironically, as someone who had always promoted, said literary and cultural and sort of progressive political links between Iran and the Arab world, there's something ironic that the bad guys, so to speak, the Iranian regime, had been able to make these extensive links, and now a lot of it on a sectarian basis, but some of it also beyond that. So that was, you can say basically Soleimani is a fascinating case of transnationalism. It's after all not very common to have an army led by a country which includes many people from many different nations. Now, of course, there are transnational armies. There have always been. But in this case, they were very serious, like tens of thousands of Afghans, Pakistanis, Iraqis, of course, Syrians, and in some more indirect ways, Lebanese and Palestinians who, all gathered this force under this one man who had become this sort of the regional icon. So that's why I was very interested in working on him and researching him. But when he was killed by the United States in 2020, the publisher that I had sort of spoken about this before basically gave me sort of a final ultimatum and said, if you want to write this book, now is the time. And so I wrote it.
And interesting was the kind of research you conducted for the book. So how were you able to carry that out? Especially that you interviewed his driver. So how was that process like?
In Iran, there's a very fertile media scene. So there are, of course, there's a lot of press oppression and there's very little press freedom. But nevertheless, there are literally hundreds of media outlets now. A lot of them websites. A lot of them just copy off each other, but at any rate, there are websites, and they interview people. And there's a lot of them on the conservative side of things, and they interview people. So the media culture in Iran is that you call someone on the phone and you start speaking, and they usually start speaking back, right? So that's how, if you see many diaspora journalists interview many sort of important figures. So it's basically, once you get the phone number, it's all about how you, it's all about how you manage that conversation. I mean, if you can get someone on the phone. So I was able to get that gentleman on the phone, who used to drive Soleimani in the years of the war, and after. It was one of the main people who did that. And it was clear my questions were not hostile. And he also wasn't telling me, of course, any state secrets or anything. He was just sort of talking personally about his relationship, whatever I've included in the book. So he spoke. Also, I should say that around the time of Soleimani's killing, there were so many different things coming out in Persian about Soleimani, about his life. So many. Every newspaper in Iran had a sort of a special issue dedicated to it. So I guess they were used to getting these calls and speaking about it. So now, obviously he had no way of knowing what. I mean, I didn't lie or anything. I said, I'm Azizi, but Azizi is a very common name. So they said, so I'm Azizi, I'm trying to write on Soleimani, if you would speak your memoirs. And he did graciously share. So, and same with the many other figures that I've spoken to. Of course, some of the people, let's say the IRGC folks involved in various operations, I mean, that was harder because these are not the people who have a phone number that you just call. But, I had my ways through different contacts in the region and in Iran itself. And the motivation of a lot of them to speak to someone like me, I think it's that a lot of times this happens when something is a bit hush-hush, and Iran's intervention in the Arab world is a bit wink and hush-hush sometimes in its own ways. I mean, much less now, but a lot of details of the hush-hush. They also feel like they're not being, they're not being valued, and their contributions are basically forgotten. So that usually gives them a good initiative to speak. And of course, then when they're speaking, sometimes they let in. They don't intend to say anything that's classified, but they let in even in the middle of a conversation or in tone. They let you in and reveal some stuff that I hope have been useful in the book.
And what challenges did you face while writing the book, besides not being there physically in Iran? And I would assume that the amount of propaganda that you had to go through was immense. So how did you comb through it, and how did you classify it accordingly?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So not being able to go there was obviously an impediment. Although I had the benefit of the fact that my mother is from Kerman, where Soleimani is from, the province that Soleimani is from. And so she knew a lot of people there. And, so we have a lot of family links there. So I could speak to a lot of people who were from there. In terms of propaganda, it's interesting because there's a lot of propaganda for Soleimani, a lot of propaganda against Soleimani also. I mean, this sort of Syrian opposition channels that I try to read, I mean, they have stuff that are obviously, so a lot of them are, they painted him as the actual devil, they said things that clearly they couldn't have been true, or there was no evidence for them. So there was a lot of propaganda both for him and against him that is basically not true. The way I cut through this, I think, I'm interested to know what happened, number one. That's a bit, basic empiricist sort of goal, to know what happened. And then, obviously I have my own interpretations, right? But first of all, it's to establish what happened. And I feel like when you look at all the information out there, actually the basics of what happened to a large degree becomes clear. Because when you look at all the propaganda for and against, you're like, okay, when they converge, is that they do actually agree on some stuff, right? On what basically happened. Like, did Soleimani go to Tuz Hormatu or not? Right? So Tuz Hormatu is this little Turkmen village in Iraq that Soleimani parachuted. Because, okay, everybody is saying he went there on all sides, right? So it's quite likely that he did. And then, I'm on the conservative side, basically. So I don't publish something unless I'm kind of more on the short side. Of course, you can never be 100% sure of anything. So to give you an example, I did write that Soleimani went to Tuz Hormatu. I did write that he went to Lebanon twice during the war with Hezbollah-Israel war of 2006, because they sounded plausible, basically, on the balance of evidence. I did revealed for the first time in the book that Soleimani ordered the killing of Hadi, president of Yemen, because again, on balance of evidence, it sounded like it sounded like quite likely. And I didn't have any reason to think the sources that were telling me in the urgency were lying about this. But it didn't include, for example, his claim that he had gone to Gaza. Right now, a lot of his supporters say he went to Gaza, back and forth. It didn't make sense to me, right? It's just too dangerous. And Soleimani actually knew his Israelis too well to sort of risk himself like that by going in their backyard. So, so that's basically how I determine what to put in and what not to put in.
But could you sort of like narrate his story briefly to give like a kind of like an outline to the people, to listeners, people that might not know who we're talking about, the Karate Kid, and how he rose through the ranks to becoming one of Khomeini's like loyal soldiers?
Well, they gotta read the book, but I'll give you the potted version here. Qassem Soleimani was, it's also interesting because I think as a biographer, the first question every biographer has is, it kind of brings into question the whole purpose of biography in a way. Should we be interested in one person? Why should we be interested in one person, right? Because why not just write about Iran's intervention in the Arab world and you start in whenever you want to start, but not with someone's birth in the 1950s. Like, why have all those things, write about the Shah, write about the land reform, write about all that I do? But I am a big fan of the genre of biography because I believe people make history. Now, history makes us, but we also make history. And I think it's this interaction that's important. So Soleimani was a boy from a humble area in the Kerman province in the south of Iran. In fact, he was about 200 kilometers from the provincial center. He was in this little place, Anat Malek. So he was born in this little place, and like many others in his youth, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 happened. So giving the pilot version. So he was a young man when the revolution of 1979 happened in Iran and changed everything, overthrew the monarchical government, brought a new Islamic Republic, and he was part of the generation of millions of Iranians who really used this revolution and the war with Iraq that ensued. So a year after the revolution in 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq attacked Iran, and the 8-year war started. So the Islamic Republic really built itself through this war, and it did so primarily by building this militia that you also mentioned in your introduction, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC. So Soleimani, he was, before the revolution, he was into karate. He was kind of a gym rat. I think it's the term. He did Iranian athletic sports, and that's why actually when he first wanted to join IRGC, they rejected him because he sort of, he didn't look like a revolutionary. He had he looked like a tough boy, and he had really big muscles, but so he had very, tight shirts, and his hair was up. Didn't look like someone who didn't like a good Muslim boy who was going to join the Revolutionary Guard. But they allowed him after a while, and this to the day he was killed in January 3rd of 2020, and he never left the IRGC. So he dedicated his life to this militia, whose purpose was, it's a very particular militia, whose purpose was not to serve Iran. That they had a discussion, should we put Iran in the name of the organization? And they decided against it. Sort of a very remarkable fact, because they decided that no, this should be a Islamic Guards Corps, and it should be dedicated to what they consider to be a spread of Islam and Islamic revolution. But also, after the death of the founding supreme leader of the revolution, Khomeini, Ayatollah Khamenei came to power, who is in power now even. That's in 1989, and then IRGC became really a personal Praetorian Guard even for Khamenei to spread his power. And I explain all this stuff in the book. But so the story of the book is how a boy from a very marginal area of Iran goes to become a global celebrity. And he did so by his years of war in Iraq, of how he rose as a commander, and how in the last couple of decades of his life, he became tasked with this project that Iran had, which was to organize like-minded militias in the region, mostly in the Arab world, and to organize them together in this massive army that they basically, they call axis of resistance. These are forces that are united on their opposition to the United States and opposition to Israel and not just opposition, really sort of a annihilatory, if you take toward Israel, and of course the fact that Iran leads this access in recent years found a very unfortunate reality, which was because Iran is a Shia state, obviously, this axis of resistance also became heavily sectarian. And actually, in a way, so let me sum it up like this. This book tells two stories, really. One is the story of how a young boy from a marginal place becomes a global celebrity through the military, and he's able to organize tens of thousands of men in other countries to convince them to die for his ideas, basically, because that's what organizing an army is. The other is the story of how a revolution that had universal kind of ambitions in 79, and it really wanted to change the world in whatever way, really descended into a quagmire of the ugly realities of sectarianism in our region, i.e. of Shias killing Sunnis and Sunnis killing Shias. Now, I don't think you can ever reduce the Quds force to that, and I try to explain that. After all, there are Sunnis in its ranks in its own ways, but it did in the 2010s, especially in the years following the Arab Spring, sectarianism, and actually even before the Arab Spring, in the years following the Iraq War, in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, sectarianism became a very real, as I said, ugly reality in our region, and Soleimani and the Quds force, unfortunately, have a big role of spreading it. And it's always both-sided, right? They're spreading it, and they're fighting it. ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are spreading their own murderous anti-Shia politics. So it's also a story of that, the story of collapse of universalist revolutionary ideals to a sectarian quagmire.
And what do you think was the most significant thing he left behind, that defined his legacy? If it was one thing, what would that be?
It's a very good question, because it's also a legacy that's very much under attack, by the people of the region, actually, partly. I think his most important legacy was for Iran to be able to have a united, or at least coordinated, political and military front comprising of many different Arab nations. More particularly, the depth of Iraq is really sort of his life achievement in a sense, that he was able to organize pro forces in Iraq that are very much pro the regime in Iran. And these forces continue to have an important role in our Iraqi politics, and that really wouldn't have been possible without Soleimani. But at the same time, as I say, these are both legacies that are very much under threat. It's not hard to imagine. I think it's possible that in 10 years, Iraq would have very little of such forces, and that the Iranian regime, even if it survives, would have to give up on this expensive project of trying to have this coordinated national armies. In fact, 10 years, maybe in a few years. So, in a way, Soleimani's story is really tragic, even if you don't have the, his killing in mind. Is that it's tragic for his own purposes? I mean, because the main man and the main regime he served, Khamenei and the Islamic Republic, are both in deep crisis, and very likely, Khamenei will die, and his own legacy is very likely to be unraveled. So it's very likely that Soleimani's life would ultimately, from the perspective of years later, be seen as that of a defeated project.
And how do you think his assassination, or even before that question, why do you think he was assassinated? What do you think led to that decision being taken?
It's a very good question. It's much easier to ask me what I think about that assassination or what the consequences, but why did Donald Trump decide to do that? That's a very good question. And I think ultimately only Donald Trump can answer that, perhaps. But I think the answer is that Trump wanted some conference. Basically, it fits with his policy towards Iran. When you see his policy was basically an aggressive brinksmanship, aimed, in my opinion, not ultimately at overthrowing of the regime, which is not what Trump wanted, but at making a deal with it. He wanted to make a deal with the regime. His idea was, if you really hit hard against these guys, if you go where nobody else would, i.e. Soleimani, then maybe you can achieve what you want with them. And it didn't work. In a very real sense, it didn't work. Although had Trump got a second term, if anybody's guessed what would have happened, it's not impossible that he would have been able to make a deal with the regime, frankly, because they really were under a lot of pressure. So it was part of his maximum pressure that he would go where nobody else would, and he would kill this guy. Soleimani had, of course, it wasn't hard to assassinate him for any U.S. president before that. They really wanted to, because he was moved so much, and it surely wasn't that hard to get his coordinates. But they went out of their way not to do that. In fact, under George W. Bush, when they were killing others, like Ahmad Moghni, I believe Moghni was in Bush's time, they wanted to make sure they only hit Moghni when Soleimani is not there. So that's basically they had been a policy of trying to avoid it. And in fact, the U.S. kind of talked and negotiated with him many times under many different administrations, including George W. Bush. They negotiated with him later on, Petros. Sort of indirectly, but they negotiated with him through Iraq, through other channels in Geneva. They negotiated with him. So the idea that you would go and kill him was really just outside the imagination or outside sort of possibility. But Trump did it because that's who Trump is. He wanted to go beyond what was probable before.
Yeah. And what do you think this assassination has brought about? Did it change Iran's regional ambitions, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East? What do you make of it? The aftermath.
Yeah, the Soleimani's shoes have not been filled. His successor Ismail Qaani is just a different kind of cat, as we say. He is he's not as charismatic. He doesn't speak Arabic properly. Basically, Quds Force haven't even tried. So Ismail Qaani is the commander of the Quds Force, the external operations wing of the IRGC. But they know you cannot have another Soleimani. So they're not even trying to have another Soleimani. So the first consequence is that, yes, Iran personnel does matter. And the Iranian regime lost one of its most important figures, who was able to play an unparalleled role in organizing these militias in the region. It's also true that there were tons of other factors that led to this challenging of these militias in the region, which includes, the popular movements in Iraq and Lebanon in 2019, shifts in Iraqi politics, determination for Iraqi sovereignty that I think is really strong there. And Iraq has gone through a lot in the last 3 years. It changed prime ministers a few times. It has seen rise and fall of Moqtada. It has its, that's a book in itself, right? But so the immediate consequence is that, but ultimately, as I said, it's not just the killing of Soleimani, but the other events that have really challenged the Iranian regime. Also, the domestic, of course, we have a revolutionary movement since last year against the regime, and many other factors. Ultimately, we should also remember that it was a very dangerous decision in many ways, and it could have really led to something bigger than it did. The fact that it didn't doesn't mean that it was impossible. This is one thing that happened. People say, "Oh well, look, we killed Soleimani, and the war that you said is going to happen didn't happen." It's a silly thing to say because, of course, wars don't happen all the time. Those who warn against brinksmanship and dangerous decisions warn about the possibility that they might occur. and the possibility was always there. So it was definitely a very dangerous decision, I would say, that could have led to much worse than it has. But in effect, it did degrade the capabilities of the Islamic Republic in the region. There is no question about that.
And he was only the Ahmad Mughni, I think, or the guy that replaced him as the head of the Quds Force. Is he still in place?
Yes, it is Ismail Ghani. Mughni got killed years before Soleimani. Yeah, Ismail Ghani is the one who replaced him, and but he doesn't have the qualities that Soleimani has. I mean, Soleimani, as I say, doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the relationship with the Arab world, because Ismail Ghani's point was always Iran's relationship to the East. So Ismail Ghani is an Afghan-Pakistan expert. He is not an Arab world expert. An Arab world is where main sort of presence of the Quds Force is. So Ghani has really struggled. Now, he goes to Iraq a lot, he goes to Damascus a lot, but he has really struggled to fill Soleimani's shoes. And it was always clear that, that he cannot do it. I mean, he was Soleimani's second in command, right? So it was clear that he will be the next Quds Force leader. But he hasn't been able to fill in those shoes.
So as being a Quds Force commander, is it, because from what I could tell, it's a role for life. You just hold on to it till you basically don't get shuffled or anything.
No, that's not true necessarily. The first commander of the Quds Force, after all, did get shuffled, Ahmad Wahidi. He is actually the interior minister now. And Soleimani was different, right? Soleimani was a special guy. So you are not going to put him out of that job. No, but Ghani can absolutely get shuffled one of these days. He's second in command is Zadeh. And there are others. As Khamenei does shuffle. I mean, not very regularly, like not every couple of years. But no, absolutely. It is entirely possible that Khamenei would at some point make some personal changes in the Quds Force. He does so with other forces as well. And of course, Khamenei is going to die, and he's not very young, and there will be important changes then, and then that's anybody's guess as to what IRGC is going to do. Maybe they will disband the Quds Force at some point. Maybe they'll change it. These are all possibilities.
Yeah, was the IRGC involved in the suppression of the most recent Iranian uprising?
Yes, IRGC is involved in, as I said, IRGC has a central role in controlling much of the Iranian armed forces. So this includes the police, this includes the riot forces. It definitely had a role in suppressing the protests in Iran.
And what do you think threatens the IRGC long term?
That's a good question. What does it threaten them long term? I think what threatens them, perhaps ironically, is that after Khamenei's killing, the power might be just thrown into their lap, so to speak. And they're not a united organization. They don't have without Khamenei, it's hard to imagine what would happen to them. I mean, I think that's the question. Because Khamenei, as I said, has really orchestrated power in Iran. But without him, they don't have a strong figurehead. Salami, this guy who is currently the head of them, he's a time server. He's not a serious sort of charismatic figure. He's not leadership material. So I think that would be the real challenge. I think after the death of Khamenei is the real challenge for the IRGC to see what's going to be their future.
All right, and finally, why should people buy your book?
Well, number one, buying an author's book is the best thing you can do to support the author and to support the very practice of having books. If you like having books about something, books are hard to produce, but the least you can do is to buy them. So that would it's important it's sort of important support. And I think if you want to know more about what we talked about today, or if you just want a story that I hope I have tried to make the story that anyone could follow of again with sort of interlocking questions of how a boy from margins of Iranian society could rise to become this big operative that would be on the cover of Newsweek. Like, how do you go from margins of Iran to cover of Newsweek and cover stories in New Yorker, or just biggest stories in New Yorker? And the other question is, how did this Islamic Republic, how did it come to do what it does in the region? You hear every time in the news the strongest man in the world, the U.S. president, for years has spoken about Iran's role in the region. How did Iran come to have its role in the region that causes so much anguish in the region and beyond? So these are some of the things that might make the book worth reading.
Definitely, it is indeed a fascinating book. Thank you so much for your time, Arash. It was been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. And my second book is coming soon about Iran's new movement and the revolution. And I hope we can talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll leave the link in the description to everyone. They should buy it. Thank you.